Good morning, John Adamson with See No Evil. As usual, we have funky lighting in my office, which is my car. But that's just the way it is when you have a low tech YouTube channel. I've got my tea. I've been trying to drink tea more than coffee because, well, I know it's healthier. And I got my little T-Mobile Tuesdays cup insulated here. But you're not here for that. You're here for the intersection of politics and religion. Actually, I was thinking about this morning. Here's this little perk cup that T-Mobile gave out to me. They have free stuff they would give out on Tuesdays. I don't even know if that's going on right now because so many businesses have had to cut back on perks during this time of COVID. Why? Is it because of the disease itself? Well, no, it's because of government shutdowns that prevent businesses from making money, that therefore correlates with less stuff available to the customer. Which gets into our discussion today. But first, our word of the day. What is our word of the day? It's the word hypocrite. Now, I probably don't need to define this word for you, but I'm going to go ahead and define it anyway. Noun. It's a person who pretends to have virtues, moral or religious beliefs, principles, etc., that he or she does not actually possess. Especially a person whose actions belie, I should use that as a word of the day sometime, whose actions belie stated beliefs. In other words, they say one thing and they do something else. There you go. Dictionary.com. I summarized that whole statement into much briefer and easier to understand, digestible little snippet. So let's look at some hypocrites in the government. Have you heard of Gavin Newsom? Gavin Newsom, he is the governor of California. How is he a hypocrite? Well, California, as you know, is a Democratic stronghold and one of the most repressive of all the state governments when it comes to COVID. They've had tremendous lockdown requirements, all put into effect by some local municipalities like mayors. But Gavin Newsom, as governor, has been very much involved in this. And so he's put in various restrictions, including things like no gatherings above 10 people, no meetings where you have 3 or more households represented. So why am I saying Gavin Newsom is a hypocrite? Oh, and mask mandates. Because Gavin Newsom was videotaped without his knowing, because he went to a swanky restaurant with some friends to celebrate a buddy's 50th birthday. Swanky. I mean, we're talking hundreds of dollars per plate. And guess what? There was more than 10 people. They were from more than 3 households. They were indoors. He tried to claim in an apology it was outdoor, but I mean, if you look at the video, it's so clear it's indoors. Ridiculous. And nobody was wearing a mask, and they were all very close together, and they're yucking it up, and they're apparently talking very loudly, according to the actual video, to the point where some people in the restaurant actually had to close a door between their party, which was actually a glass partition so you could see what was going on. They had to close the door because they were so loud. And you know what happens when you speak loud? You tend to spit. And you send things into the air, like COVID. Big truck brake behind me. So Gavin Newsom is a hypocrite. He preaches one thing, do this and we'll be safe, and he makes it so that businesses have to be closed, and he makes sure that there are repercussions to the common people if they don't obey. That's one hypocrite. Well, you know Nancy Pelosi, right? Speaker of the House, strong proponent of government shutdowns, including to her local area of San Francisco. Another California Democrat. You might remember a few months ago, she decided to go to a hair salon. A hair salon that had been closed according to government mandate to all business. But a little pressure from one of her staffers, and voila, it's open. Now, she's hypocritical. Why? Because she's been such an advocate of wearing the mask, and the mask is actually essential, and it's preventing the disease spread, and blah, blah, blah. And lo and behold, we have video footage of her in the hair salon walking around with wet hair without a mask and getting blow dried. She went there for a blow in style or whatever they called it. Because, she's got to look just right for her speakership. Hypocrite. And she issued, just like Gavin Newsom issued a ridiculous apology, where it was really a non-apology, it was just making excuses. She did the same. In fact, Nancy Pelosi went further. She blamed the hair salon for setting her up. Oh, Nancy, you're smarter than that. You're a hypocrite. What about Lori Lightfoot, mayor of Chicago? Now, you might have seen her in the news. I mean, she makes the news once in a while. I mean, it's a big city, Chicago. She makes the news once in a while, and she made the news back in April. So we were in full swing of lockdowns at that time. And Chicago, like most Democrat, I should say, controlled cities and states, put in some fairly draconian, there's another good word, draconian lockdowns. And one of them was, of course, hair salons, because of the potential spread of the disease. Well, Lori Lightfoot, what did she do? Well, she went and got her hair done when she had made a public service announcement saying to people, look, you don't need to go get your hair done. You can let it grow a little bit long. You don't need to have the roots colored, yada, yada, yada. And then she goes and does the same thing. And guess what she's seen doing? Posing with one of the hairstylists without a mask. And then she issued an apology. Well, not an apology. It was an excuse. She said, look, I have to be in the public light, so my hair has to look a certain way. Hypocrite. Saying one thing and doing another. But in these cases, these individuals are even worse because they coerced people through government power to not do things that they went ahead and flaunted anyway. There's another good word of the day, flaunted. Hypocrites. In all of these situations, we see the definition of hypocrite spelled out very clearly. Saying one thing, doing another. But let me compare this to another story of a non-hypocrite and then bring up a hypocritical situation for you. Pardon me. I'm sorry, guys. Allergy City this morning, and now I've got like dust blowing everywhere. Have you ever heard the name Madison Cawthorn? If you're astute in politics, if you watched the Republican National Convention this year, you know who this guy is. He's a 25-year-old paraplegic who, in a wheelchair, spoke at the Republican National Convention and stood up from his chair. I didn't actually watch the whole speech, but he made waves, and he ended up winning a congressional seat for the United States House of Representatives in North Carolina. So he's one of the young, I think he's maybe the youngest representative ever. He's 25, which is the age you've got to be to run for Congress. So he's the youngest congressman ever. With that said, Madison Cawthorn is in the news. What is he in the news about? He's in the news because he is on tape and in interviews talking about how he proselytizes. What is proselytization? It's where you try to convert somebody from another faith to your faith. And you could probably guess it, Madison Cawthorn is a Christian, an evangelical Christian. And so he's talked freely about his willingness to talk to people of other faiths. He's actually a pastor, something he's going to have to give up, obviously, when he serves. He does other things, but this guy is the real deal. He practices what he preaches. And so the media is up in arms about this. People are upset. How could you do that? Try to convince Jews and Muslims to change their faith. And he talks freely about how he's had some successful encounters, and it is harder, though, for him to witness to really Orthodox Jews because they really practice what they believe, and they are harder to convince of the gospel of Jesus Christ. So he's been very straightforward with this, and people don't like it. But he is not a hypocrite. Now, what am I saying? Why am I saying this? Why am I bringing up this comparison? Because I believe that most people who profess that they are Christians are hypocrites, unlike Madison. So, for example, the Bible tells us that we are all sinners, every single one of them. And it tells us that we earn eternal damnation because of our sin, which separates us completely from a holy God. It tells us that hell is a real place, and it's forever. There's no being sprung from it. And it's where you spend eternity in bitter agony. You have unquenchable thirst. You suffer in mind, body, and soul. And you have full knowledge when you're in hell that you deserve to be there. Imagine the worst guilt you've ever felt about doing something wrong. I mean, maybe to the point where you broke down and cried. That's how guilty you felt. Imagine that amplified by a number you can't possibly imagine, and experiencing that forever and ever. That is the knowledge that a born-again believer has. What is a born-again believer? It's somebody that recognizes that they're a sinner. I'm a sinner. You're a sinner. And we deserve eternal damnation because of it. Because there is a just and holy God, and he cannot let sin go unpunished. He cannot let unholiness in his presence. So we are bound for hell without Jesus. It's a very straightforward message. So the Bible commands us to love one another as we love ourselves. It commands us to love each other as Christ loves the church, sacrificially. It calls for us to sacrifice our comfort in the here and now so that we might have eternal comfort. And I'm not saying we earn that comfort by any means. I'm just saying if we're a faithful servant to God, we're not going to worry about our comfort here and now. Because it's uncomfortable sometimes to share the gospel with people. Sometimes, in some countries, even today, to the point of death, uncomfortable. So if we truly love one another, we are going to proselytize. Because if what I said were true, propositions earlier, that we're sinners, that sin earns us death, that we're bound for eternal damnation, and that Christ, here's the other proposition, that Christ is the only way to eternity, and we don't share that message with other people, we're a hypocrite because we're really not loving others. Imagine, if you will, that you're on the edge of a cliff. You may have heard this analogy before. And you see a line of people coming right towards the cliff. What's unusual about them is they're all wearing blindfolds. They cannot see where they're going. And surely if they just keep walking and walking, they're just going to pitch themselves right off the cliff to their certain doom. Now, would it be loving to say, well, that's the path they've chosen, and so I don't want to impede, their decisions. It's their decision to go that path. I'm just going to let them go. No, that's not loving. You're going to be shouting, jumping up and down, pushing them away from the cliff edge, trying to save them and direct them in the way they should go so that they don't fall off the cliff and die as soon as they hit the ground. That is what we would do in real life. Why don't we do that in the person's spiritual life? We don't want to be a hypocrite. Finally, well, not finally, but I'm going to give you one more story. This is a story, I don't know the validity of it, but it perfectly illustrates the problem with hypocritical Christianity that believes that salvation is through Christ alone, but does nothing about it. There's two guys that worked in an office, and we'll just call them Bob and Jim. Bob was a very vulgar man, obviously not a believer. He was a heavy drinker. He never went to church. His marriage was kind of on the rocks. He had, problems with his home life, but he was a high performer at work, and he worked hard, and he was, the company enjoyed having him because of that. Then you had Jim. Now, Jim is a Christian, and Jim has got a good family life. He loves his kids. He's a hard worker. And Bob and Jim work together in the same office, and they work for a number of years together. Now, Jim never shares the gospel of Jesus Christ, but he follows the philosophy that so many Christians have bought into, which is this philosophy from a quote: "Preach the word in season and out of season, and when necessary, use words." That is a lie, folks. It's only through the Word of God, knowing the Word itself, hearing the Word, that faith comes. If you have any doubt of that, read Romans chapter 1. So anyway, Bob and Jim are working together for years. Bob continues to live his life that's profane. He ends up getting a divorce. He goes through some relation issues, but he continues to work. Jim continues to just be faithful in his daily life. He stays quiet, but he shows a good example for those around him. Finally, something happens in Bob's life, and Jim notices there's been a change. He's no longer swearing. He's kind and considerate towards people. His work, which was already pretty good, picks up a bit and becomes even more efficient. He seems more rested, more calm, more peaceful. Finally, Jim is so curious, he goes to Bob and he says, "Bob, I've noticed that you've had a change in your life." And Bob says, "Oh yes, let me tell you, I've become a Christian. The Lord has changed my life, and I can't tell you how it feels. It's remarkable, the changes that I've been able to experience through God's love." And Jim goes, "Well, that's wonderful, brother. I'm a Christian too." And suddenly Bob takes on a very serious look. And he actually looks a little bit upset. And Jim says, Bob, what's wrong?" And Bob looks at him and says, "Jim, you are one of the reasons that I did not listen to any talk about religion or Christianity for so long. Because I looked at you, who had a good marriage, was a hard worker, was a nice guy, and I looked at you as an example of a guy who could do those things without God, because you never told me one iota about Jesus Christ." As Jim was acting the part of a hypocrite, believing one thing, but not talking about it. If we truly believe that people are pitching themselves off the cliff without Jesus, we've got to be willing to share that. I'm going to leave you with two things. One is a word. See, we talked about hypocrite, saying one thing or believing one thing and then doing the opposite. But now let's talk about the opposite of that word, and that is the word integrity. You can be hypocritical, but you can also have integrity, which means doing and saying the same thing, or believing and doing the same thing. That's integrity. And that's what Christians should have. Philippians 2:17. The Apostle Paul was in prison. He's writing the letter to the church at Philippi. His life at this point has been marked with suffering and pain, imprisonment, and separation from people that he loves. And this is part of what he writes. But even if I am being poured out like a drink offering on the sacrifice and service coming from your faith, I am glad and rejoice with all of you. A Christian's life should be marked by sacrifice, which means that you need to have integrity in both what you believe and what you say and do. And that may cause problems for you in this life. And a life unmarked by some kind of suffering and difficulties, if you're a Christian, you really got to question your faith. This is John Adamson with See No Evil. Go out and don't be a hypocrite. Take care and God bless.